Livecast right here on LinkedIn Live. We're here today. Tyler Marcus, why don't you introduce yourself to the crowd?
Hey, Tyler. Good to meet everybody. Excited to talk about retention and turnover. Marc and I have been doing our LinkedIn Livecasts almost every month to discuss different topics in HR and rethinking HR, how we could use innovation and different technologies and different strategies to drive HR, innovation and change. So today we're discussing talent retention and turnover. Marc, maybe share a bit more about this topic and what interested you in doing this for this podcast.
Yeah, so I'm Marc Wolfe, and I've been on LinkedIn since 2008. Thought it was cool back then. It's gone so much bigger, and the reason we're doing these live casts is just because there's an audience out there that really has questions about things that they still have to deal with every day. So my role at Marc Wolfe Enterprises is strategy, innovation, and taking ideas that come from employees or leadership and making sure they get executed on. Right? It's more than just about talk. It's about actually doing and implementing. And that all starts with people. That's why HR is a topic that Tyler and I are never going to avoid, nor is anyone in business going to be able to avoid. It's a thing.
Can't avoid the people part of business as much as AI.
Even with AI, you still have to have people actually putting in some prompts. So it doesn't matter. People are important. Let's not avoid them.
Exactly. And I run Gradmor, a talent intelligence company. So I'm on the analytics side of HR. So I balance Marc's art out with my science, and and we share different perspectives about things from me from a numerical world and Marc from the art side of the world. But we believe that makes a marriage in heaven, art and science. So today, really excited to talk about turnover. It's an area that companies, depending on your industry, have issues with. It goes in and out of waves. I know turnover, over the course of, human history for work, or even in the past 5 years there's been bad years of turnover, good years of turnover, obviously with COVID and hybrid, and how working has affected that. But Marc, maybe you could touch a bit on, some recent news that you've read about turnover and how that in retention.
Well, it's just interesting because turnover, sometimes it's forced upon you and sometimes you force it upon yourself. So there was a recent article about Wells Fargo. No, not that one where everybody got fired because they were making fake accounts. No, this is new Wells Fargo news. And it was about, there was an investigation at Wells Fargo when they found out that people were using mouse jigglers. Now, if you're not familiar with a mouse jiggler, it's to make it look like you're busy working, because what was Wells Fargo doing? Well, they have this hybrid environment, and to prove you're working, again, I don't work at Wells Fargo, to prove you're working, you would obviously be using your mouse. So when you're not, you would have a mouse jiggler to make it look like you're working. Well, there was a way that Wells Fargo found out and fired people for doing this. And Wells Fargo, you got to think there's a few different things that concern me about this whole story, right? Not knowing the whole story. It just came out a few days ago. First of all, is like they're spying on their people, which means what to you, right? Could mean they don't trust their people and they have to be doing something, which means you're going to go and implement something to avoid actually being seen that you're not doing it. Did they get their jobs done and this was just filling time and they needed it? There's so many other questions, but ultimately these people were working for the company and they were retained, but were they actually doing their job, and what was really going on? Tyler,
well, maybe the mouse jiggler is like the modern version of the water cooler, where like some employees like spend 2 hours, they start their work, they come into the office at 9 and then they start their work at noon and leave late to kind of like show that they're, that they're committed.
Seinfeld episode, George Costanza parking his car in the Yankee Stadium parking lot, right?
Yes.
To make it look like he worked late. Yeah, it could be a comparison.
Yeah, it's the new version. It's the mouse jiggler, I think, and now brings it full circle, where it's like, okay, if people are going to measure, if they're measuring my success based on time and based on mouse movements, maybe that's not the best way to do that. And maybe metric driven. Maybe we should become more metric driven. I did a whole study on with salespeople, and there was a company that had used a productivity tool that was like measuring sales rep productivity. And it would measure like how often they spent their time on email, how often they spent their time on the CRM, like a Salesforce, how often they spent their time on the phone. And some of their like most productive people, based on the scoring system, were just spending their time in the CRM and not actually on the phone and email. And they were, even though they were like being marked as highly productive, they weren't delivering results because they weren't doing the activities that matter. So from a business perspective in this hybrid remote world, you got to change, I guess, how we measure success, right? And then obviously that contributes to the end of turnover and retention, because if again, like this mouse jiggling people, like if we're measuring them, if they're really good workers and productive, maybe that's not the right way to judge them. Obviously they shouldn't be doing that, but I'm just,
right.
People always find a way.
And that's part of the problem, right? It's like, if you're measuring the wrong things, people will go and make sure whatever you're measuring, I'm going to go and do that. In that example you used, where you're like, people have to put into Salesforce or some CRM. They're like, okay, because if the information is not in here, you really didn't do it. Well, how about if I was really productive and I did do everything, but I didn't report back, but the sales came through? Yeah, but you didn't report it. I was like, but the sales, we have signed contracts. There's salespeople making money. Well, that's the thing. We have to understand our environment and the people to understand what's working. And no matter how large your company is, isn't that where leadership comes in? If you're going to retain people, they leave because of who they work with and who their boss is. They actually probably like their coworkers in most cases. They just don't like their boss or the reporting system.
Yeah, no, I think retention and turnover, I think half of it is obviously like management and leadership, and change. And also like that begs the question of, when is turnover like good or bad, right? Because obviously someone is like not a good fit anymore. The company changes, there's strategic direction, there's change management, right? Oh, a company gets acquired, right? Or, we need a new strategy for the different growth phase, and the people that are in place are not the right people. It's helping understand like when retention and turnover is necessary, or like when is a strategy, when is it a priority? And that, begs the question of like, what should those strategies be if it is a priority, and when is that a priority?
I mean, this isn't as sexy a topic as hiring, because more people are like, hey, people are leaving and there's a lot of things going on. Well, it's interesting. We've done things on hiring and we get these huge crowds because everyone wants to talk about getting people. But if you can't retain them, you got a bucket that you're filling and it's leaking out the bottom, right? Because people are leaving. And what I always like to remind people is that when you add a person to a team, or somebody leaves a team, it's a brand new team every time. Let me say that differently. If you have 50 people on a team and you add someone, that person adds a dynamic to that team, hopefully, right? They're alive and they're filling a purpose. But even the worst or best person that leaves or is added to a team changes the way the whole team works. So if retention's not a priority and you keep losing people, there's this psychological cost to the team. Imagine working at Wells Fargo and being like, even if you're working, let's say you don't have a mouse jiggler. I can't stop using that word now. I'm going to say that you're going to be like, oh my gosh, they're going to fire me because I'm not as active as I should be, even though I'm doing everything right. Or maybe you're the other person that has learned how to gamify it and you're like, oh, they're going to come after me. There's still so much internal concern about this at any organization that when you see people leave, you're wondering, what do they know that I don't know? And when they stay and they don't work, they're like, well, why do I have to work so hard when they don't? So Tyler, these are just some of the costs. What else?
Yeah, no, totally. I'm just one more point on that. Also, like, I feel like retention strategy isn't separate from hiring. And I feel like there's a misconception because how you hire if you hire right for what your culture, organization, position is, your retention should increase, right? So I always feel like hiring and retention kind of like they do overlap a bit, and yet I feel like a lot of times in like the people space and HR, it's like, oh, retention is over here and hiring is over here, and it's like, no, actually, there's a relationship between those things. And then when it comes to retention when someone's within a team, I think there's good and bad. Like I call there's like good and bad turnover or good and bad retention, because you want to retain your best people. You want to retain the people that are good fit. And then there's also people that just aren't over time. And, retaining someone who may not be a fit in the long run can actually become, I'm sure you've seen, can become a toxic situation, as I've seen. So it's really figuring out the nuances between that. And then ultimately, like, what those costs are. And what we found is, like, turnover costs are different depending on the company. So when I've done, things on turnover costs, it's about, like, things. Let's give a quick example, right? You have a manufacturing company, okay, and you have high turnover. Your turnover costs could be a lot more than you think if it takes time to train and I guess, like, develop a new person to make them fully productive. Your cost of turnover may be the fact that, like, now you can't finish a project in time because your people are not there, right? So a lot of times, like, turnover costs, I feel like companies either overestimate the costs or underestimate the costs, and it really depends on the makeup, and it depends on the company, and it depends on the industry that is there. So from like a financial perspective, or understanding how much that is and what that is a good step, is a way to rethink it, and it's a good step to then addressing turnover and retention at your company, as opposed to going backwards where it's like, oh, we have 30% turnover. What does that really mean for your company? I mean, It depends.
Yeah, you bring up a lot of great points. It's most people don't get spun up in a role immediately. It takes time. And even if let's say they were a salesperson, right? You're like, well, people know how to sell. They can sell anything. That's why we hired them. They're going to be fantastic. The problem is that they're selling a different product with a different system in a different environment with different people. That's still going to require a change. They're still going to have to build relationships, etc. And if you have somebody, and we know that salespeople sometimes turn over a lot more than anybody else because I heard in the past, they're called coin operated. I go wherever the money is, right? Then, so you have this, but there's an expectation, but you expect them to stay for a certain period of time. So what I'm hearing, Tyler, is that there should be some matrix that you have. If we hire for this position, we should have so much time we know it takes them to train, and it should be at 60 or 80% capacity by the third month. And then, by the way, our expectation based on this role will be that they'll stay 18 months because of this role. And we know there's a wind down, because if they're going to stay 18 months, at month 15, we see them starting to diminish because they're already looking for their next role. Like, you can use these examples. And the thing is that if you have a lot of people, this is where Tyler and I help, right? We look at a lot of the analytics. We look at how this plays out. We look at trends that are even leading indicators to say, hey, by the way, are you seeing degradation in your salespeople or in a team? Or you blame it on, well, it was because this environment happened, or it was the Final Four. So all of a sudden we saw this. No, we're talking about longer trends than just, the World Cup is on and people, or the Super Bowl is on. We're talking about longer trends. This is the kind of data that once you get together and you start talking to people, and we do assessments to understand people, all of a sudden you start to see patterns, or at least we do, where we go and say, hey, by the way, this is what you should do. Let's talk about that for a minute, though, because this is really where the cost is, helping move people past this, Tyler.
Yeah, and I think it all depends on your company. I also think, I find that, like, generally turnover is worse early, like, because you hire, you're starting to train, and then that person just, like, leaves. Well, you just invested all this time, plus the hiring costs. Then you have to rehire someone to fill that spot. So now it's more delayed, right? So that's bad. And then the people that are really good leaving, right? Like, it's like losing someone who's amazing is hard to replace over time, and could take 12 months or more, unless you have, like, some sort of, like, talent pipeline that's just, like, really amazing. But generally, we find that, like, those are the areas. And then when you think about the strategies of, like, okay, again, like, how could I keep people? How do I stop turnover early? Well, that probably depends on, again, hiring the right person, right? Training a certain way, leadership, right? How does that happen? So that way they don't leave early. Okay. And then later, how do you deal with keeping your best people engaged so they don't jump somewhere? Okay. As much as you can. Now, of course, that there's some of that's unavoidable, right? At some point, like, people are just like, hey, I'm going to take this, like, insane position that I'm getting offered. It has to be baked into your concept, but it's just about how do you extend that? Extending a top performer for 6 months is huge value, right? It's a huge plus. Taking your drop off after 3 to 6 months, from we lose 30% to 10 is, again, that's a huge number. So like, it's just really a matter of like what the nature of your business is and what we're trying to do. And then how you can sort of get better at that.
And that's the thing. It's not one size fits all. If you're losing them early, is it your process on the way in? And we call this rethink talent retention. There's a lot of different ways. A lot of this stuff is fundamental, but here's the part where we put a little spin on this, is that I believe that sometimes people that are working in talent acquisition, sometimes you're given restraining ways to do their work that doesn't allow for them to think what the future is. There was an article recently, based out of Nashville, and there was an article recently about AI. And should people, employers, what do they think about AI? And should future employees use it for their job applications and other things? And they interviewed 15 different companies, and from everything from construction companies to healthcare organizations, et cetera. And you know what most of the CEOs and hiring people said about AI and should it be used on the way in? They said it's a good and a bad. And their example was, for AI, it's good to see they're embracing technology, they're using it, they're trying to expand some of the things. It's bad when it's used and they can't support that information with their own words and knowledge, right? And that's the thing. It's like they can use it, but also when you ask them a question in real life and they're not actually like real life, as in they don't have a keyboard in front of them or their phone, they have to be able to answer these questions with their own words and knowledge. The same way maybe when you were growing up, you went to the library or you found resources somewhere and you had information, but you retained it and then you used it in real time.
Yeah.
If you can't do that,
does AI in the end like help or hurt retention? Right. It's
right. Right.
It's a double-edged sword. Like, I mean, yeah, AI, we get advanced AI, we're gonna lose their job, right? It's like, okay, AI is replaced. I mean, we already see it now, right? At some companies, right? They're setting up, they laid off people because they see the AI taking over those roles. And then does it benefit retention because it can automate a lot of, mundane parts of your work and keep you more engaged potentially to stay at a company? That's, again, like all these sort of technological advances, there's always a double-edged side every single time. And when you think about like social media, you think about internet, all these things have like pros and cons that are always coming out and manifesting itself. So, what do you think? Does AI help or hurt in the end?
I think it goes back to, I always embrace technology consistently because I know it won't go away, right? So if you don't look at it and you run from it and you're concerned or scared, even if you were going to lose your job, let's just say there's a lot of line workers, there's a lot of people in retail, there's a lot of other things that are being replaced, right? So you could say, well, retail was going to be replaced by catalogs because, everybody can order online. Okay. Well, if I was in retail and I knew how to sell, then I could sell other products different ways, right? You got to be able to use your skills. So I think from an employer standpoint, it's really important. You got to lower your labor costs. That's always been the case. How are you going to lower it? From a customer service, just because you have humans that are not hired correctly actually can hurt your brand. So the thing is that just having AI be able to replace certain roles that can create consistency, not phone trees, not people that look like people that are really fake, right? That freak people out in the beginning, but the ability to answer real questions actually help. Think about AI, machine learning. Think about how many times you would have spelled something incorrectly. And I've been so thankful that the plugins on my Mac are helping me with using words that are correct, correcting typos. We don't think about that and hate it. We're happy to not send things with typos and say the wrong words. But now as we're using AI and different things, we're going to be like, okay, well, how does this help me? And where's the limit before I start to go and use this so much that it actually removes the humanness in it?
Yeah. And also, like, you could use AI to help predict turnover and try to automate and understand if someone's at risk for it. Right. So based on certain criteria in the past, or if you have tools like engagement and all these different tools, are they at risk for turnover based on historical data? And then you can maybe get ahead of that game, right? So I feel like there's definitely application on the prediction side of things too, to help companies sort of like, okay, we know that on average it's a 9-month employee life cycle. If we know that based on these factors, that might help them now eliminate that gap in productivity that happens when someone leaves and they're like, oh my God, now we need to fill this role. It takes them 4 to 6 weeks to fill it. So I feel like that could also benefit companies. It's just in the prediction nature of the game. That's where I could see like AI being a positive, as long as it's used the right way. Because again, a lot of this stuff with AI and things like that, it's like, is it being used in the right way, in an ethical way, and and not in a negative way? And it's just a matter of how you can use it that way. But I don't think predicting, or at least being aware of potential turnover causes for someone is using it in a problematic way. I think if anything, it helps.
Yeah, like you said, I think it has its benefits and its drawbacks. I think employers embracing technology shows your workers that you're willing to move forward. Putting restrictions on it, which again, we can have a whole conversation, I think we will, about AI, but people putting things in ChatGPT or similar AI engines of people's intellectual property to go and check it out actually lets it get out in the wild, in essence. So there's some danger to that. And in some companies, you can be fired for that. But you have to know what the rules are. But let's talk about people who embrace technology the most, which typically, right? Gen Z, right? They're the ones that are really going, and they're the ones that are using technology, or they might use social media more often. Let's talk about, Tyler, like retaining Gen Z. Is there any difference between retaining them and any other generation?
Yeah, so it's actually funny. I met someone at a conference, and he was like a boomer. And he was straight up like, all I cared about was like if I got a check, and that was it. It's like there was none of this like, oh, what's the purpose of the job? All this sort of like, oh, like my manager, as long as I got paid. He's like, that's like always been the mentality. Gen Z is much more about like purpose and engagement and and all that. And it's a totally different mindset. So retaining it, you can't just be like throw money at it. Right. So generationally, retention strategies should shift as by generation, because the things that matter are different depending on the generation that you're in. Right. So for Gen Z, again, it's about like, what is my work? What is the purpose? How does this connect back to something bigger? Versus like older, it's like, how much, like, can I make more money? How can I, can I get a check? And if not, like, then I'll leave because I'm not getting what I deserve. It's a whole different mindset. So that's my sort of initial take. How can you need to like rethink about, even if your company isn't like some innovative company, right, in tech, like how can you position yourself to Gen Z as like, hey, like your job has a purpose for this reason. This is what it's driving. I think it kind of leads into the fact of like companies gonna have to rethink about how they think about like culture and how they engage that way.
And I'm not a boomer, even though I have gray hair. I'm Gen X, just so you know. You Gen X there, Tyler?
No, I'm millennial.
Oh, millennial. Okay. And let's talk about the millennials. So it's interesting. A lot of the people who signed up for this from our LinkedIn Lives usually again, we don't get age demographics data, but we could tell by how long they've been in the workforce. There are a lot of millennials that literally sign up for this. And part of that is they should be more aware of Gen Z, because they are different from the boomers that would just want to work for a company forever and be able to get a pension and be able to do this. And again, I'm not disparaging anyone. I'm just saying that to support Tyler's claim, it's true. Each group and each person has their own reason why they want to work for an organization. And, it went from ping pong tables and free snacks to, well, we're going to change that to, you can go and work off site, to, hey, by the way, everybody's got to come back to the office. What I see the most, and we're not just on the employer side, we're also on the employee side, understanding it's confusing when you were told, because I had friends that worked at a very large Fortune 250 company, and they were told, guess what? We're always going to be hybrid, and that's the way it's going to be. And then all of a sudden they were like, yeah, we changed our mind. Because there's a lot of other things. So this person sold their house. They moved to another location because they were like, I could work anywhere.
Right.
And the problem was like, they had to leave their job because they were like, I now I'm hours away. You told me, and I based it on what you told me. So with Gen Z, if you say something that you're going to do as an organization and you don't, they'll call you out. The boomer wouldn't, right? The boomer would stay and they would be like, well, I have my job and I have to put in my amount of years. And I know people know this, but do they really? Because I watch the actions of leadership many times and they say they have an initiative. Maybe it's DEI, maybe it's something about the way their collaboration is, maybe it's a culture thing. And then all of a sudden I was like, that's not actually what happens. And even customers know because it's in the news, but even customers know because when they walk into the organization, they're like, you guys said you were going to be doing something that was more environmental and look at all the waste, and they recognize it. It's really important if you're going to be an organization, and even if when you're in HR, when you say something, people put their trust in who they hear it from. Understand that if you say something and it's really not true, you're putting your own reputation on the line. And that's scary a lot of times because you may not work for this company for the rest of your life. So it's important that what you say, you actually know can be implemented and supported.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think DEI, like if it's executed correctly, like I think actually data shows that it does help with retention overall, as people feel more included and and all that. It's like it does help. It does make a difference. I think those initiatives can drive that and make things better. Versus maybe back in the day where it was more about like the paycheck as opposed to anything. So I think those are some good strategies just on to think about how you change engagement, how you engage with the workforce in a different way than previously and sort of measure that and track that over time.
So as we kind of land the plane here and wrap up, let's give some kind of takeaways, because there's a lot of things we went over today, a lot of stuff that, again, people might know already. But, here's some of the things that come to the top of my mind. It's like what you say as an HR leader or an executive in an organization. If you can't say it and live by it and say that you would publicly put it out there, it's very difficult for organizations to last for a while. It's great with a press release. It's great to put spin on things and say, we're this, when something happens, like the Wells Fargo thing, where all of a sudden they're like, we're a company that has integrity and we want our workers. You should have seen the comments that I saw blasting them about how this isn't the first time Wells Fargo has said something and done something different. So just understand that, you can say that and be fired as a CEO, but if you're an HR leader or somebody else and you're actually saying some of these things, if you can't say it, what kind of culture is your organization? And would you want to work for that company as a new employee, knowing that there's a difference between what's said and what's actually done? That's really important if you're rethinking what the future is going to be in talent.
Yeah. And I think on the retention side too, is just how to use data better that makes sense for your company. What are the real costs, right? How do you measure those real costs so you really understand? Because I think there's that disconnect between like executive leadership sometimes and turnover. And it's like, is this something we should be putting money, like should we be investing in? And what does that mean? And then how to use like AI to benefit, not to work against you during that. So I think that's when I think about like talent retention and rethinking it. To me, it's like, how can we use technology in the best way possible? How can we measure things and understand costs in the best way possible? And then what can we do to optimize it and make things better on the soft side, which is like your art side, which is like putting in initiatives and programs and things to retain, different generations of talent. So I think that's like sort of that would encompass it for me.
And how do we help, right? So part of what we do is looking and having conversations with companies to go and be like, let's evaluate where you are. So it doesn't have to be broken. It just needs to be improved, right? We come into organizations and look at how they assess their employees, how they're listening to them, what kind of feedback they get, what their retention looks like, and literally put together a plan to help them understand not just what is possible today, but would be possible in the future. And I'll tell you, this data, it changes the way you think, and actually employees become more engaged. It does help change culture and not just retention.
Yeah, totally. So Marc and I host these, every month or two. We pick new topics. We've done things on hiring process. We've done, things on performance and talent development. So if anybody has any other topics they want to hear about, please don't hesitate to send us a LinkedIn message or email us. But we'll be sending out another invite soon for another event, another LinkedIn Livecast. So yeah, and any other feedback would be great. We'd love to hear feedback to make our show as entertaining and informative as possible.
I think we're even going to have guests. Some of the people
we might have some guests.
up.
We might start having some guests to make a little change up.
So if you're interested and you'd like to be a guest on the show, reach out to Tyler or myself, and we'd be happy to help set this up, because we want to highlight some of the companies that have been attending, and there's lots of companies that have been attending again and again. So we want to highlight what you're doing, what's happening at your organization, even hear some of the success stories, because we want to share. There's a lot of things that people have already fixed, already worked on. We're happy to do that as well.
Yep. All right, everyone, have a great rest of your Tuesday, and we'll see you all soon on the LinkedIn